Street Gallery, and we're interviewing our inaugural wonderful internationally acclaimed artist and my former professor from UT, Stephen Daly. So welcome.
Well, thank you for that introduction.
This was quite brave of you to decide to have a show during the pandemic in Austin, Texas, and I appreciate your bravery. I just wanted to kind of do interviews with artists that are showing at the gallery and get more of the artist's voice and understanding more about you and your work and your process. And I think that is sometimes missed in the world of art, the artist's voice. So hopefully we can put a dent in that.
I'm sure it'll be a little dent, but I do understand what you mean. I think often that critics end up speaking to themselves. It's kind of a circular conversation. So it's good to have you try and prize out of us the kind of stuff that matters most, without the polysyllabic language.
This exhibit that is named Attachment spans decades of your work. So it's sort of a mini retrospective in a way, though you've had actual retrospectives. But you haven't shown a whole lot in Austin aside from faculty art shows, and so it's wonderful, to have you here, and locals have an opportunity to, get to know you and your work, hopefully in a more intimate way. How long have you been retired?
Maybe 7 years, I think.
Okay. And how long did you teach at UT?
From 1981, since 1981.
Okay, so do the math for me. How many years of teaching is that?
I don't know, because I counted from when I started teaching, which was long before I got to UT.
Sure.
So my first position was right out of grad school at University of Minnesota.
Okay.
And then we moved back to California, which is where my wife and I are both from.
Right.
And taught there until I received something called the Prix de Rome, in which case then at that point we moved to Rome.
Yeah, I will be forever jealous of you for that prize. That's such a wonderful experience.
It was, and it lasted for 2 years. The same prize is not only good for 1 year, so we were really lucky to have that particular experience. But I
did not know that. I just thought you were extra special.
But after 2 years in Rome, going back to the woods of Northern California, which is where I taught at Humboldt State University, we just thought maybe it'd be good to try a new venue. And a lot of people were talking about Texas at that point. So I got a gig at Texas A&M, the least likely school for me, with my personality, my liberalism, to really end up at. But it was delightful. It was terrific over there. We'd met a lot of people. People were wonderful to us. And it gave me a chance to travel around Texas to get to know who was doing what in the art world. And it was so impressive that we moved here. In fact, one of those faculty members was named Joe Hutchinson. And Joe is the person who called me when I finally got to UT, Austin, to ask whether or not I might be interested in starting a program in Italy. And my response took less than 5 seconds. So we started a program at Castiglione Fiorentino that eventually moved to Castiglione Fiorentino from another location.
Okay.
And that was about 1981.
Okay.
And so we were able to take many, many UT students over there.
Which is how you and I got to know each other when I had that opportunity.
There you go.
Yeah.
So as you know, it's a life-changing experience.
Absolutely.
for me as an artist, I started in music rather than in the visual arts in the 3rd grade. And my parents thought I had a problem, so they took me to a child psychiatrist because little boys don't want to learn how to play the flute, which is what I want to learn how to play. And once the shrink must have said okay, so I got private lessons all the way through high school. What I wanted for Christmas was a flute.
Yeah.
So I'm supposed to ask for a baseball bat and a mitt, see?
Yeah.
So they thought it was unique enough to try and find out if I had a problem.
I think that's actually a lovely illustration of how far we've come as a society.
Well,
So.
keep in mind though, both my mom and dad have college degrees, which is unique in itself right there, and from Ivy League East Coast. So I admire them for providing me with museum visits and the whole Encyclopedia Britannica. This is before computers, and tutoring and whatever I needed to get on the move, they took care of. So in high school, I had one of those amazing art teachers, and I changed from music to art just in one day. It was a really, really big deal. So from there on out, I started a studio practice. And started out in painting, but when I got to San Jose State in California, I kind of, quote, discovered sculpture.
Well, so wait, back up. Because I'm kind of interested in, obviously your parents had some prejudice against, oh, my son learning the flute. I would think they might have also had some reservations about you studying art, but did they learn to be supportive of that? Because certainly parents of art students, even now, might struggle with their son or daughter making a choice like that to study art.
Mm-hmm. My dad was in advertising, so he was a visual person to the extent that he knew about graphic design. And my mom was an English literature major, and so what she knew about art, she knew about aesthetics through writing. And I think that they were well prepared for me to make some kind of transition. Keep in mind, this is midway through high school by this point, and they just didn't have a problem. So,
that's great.
Yeah. And from there on out, they never have had a problem. They're extremely supportive.
How has your creative process evolved?
I would say that what I learned from music was part of the early demonstration of some kind of direction. For instance, music has an incredible amount of structure. And I've always been involved in kind of a formal structure within the work, always. Some people criticize that. That's okay with me. I believe in that. So that's a thread, not necessarily a design thread. It's a thread you can see in the art, and repetition and cadence and loud and soft. And music becomes, to me, large and small objects combined in the same image. So coming out of that allowed me, or at least the way I look back on it, to start right out with images that I thought were personal and fairly contemporary. Of course, it was all painting in the beginning, and then when I got to college, then sculpture definitely came in at that point. I started working with these grad students in San Jose, California. They had a foundry, and I asked them if I could come over and become their janitor. And they said, absolutely. So, and then they taught me everything that they knew. There were 4 of them. And there's a little book out now called Casting in the South Bay. And they're all in there. We're all in that book. But I learned a huge amount from them. And I learned, in sculpture, I learned first about working wax. And so when you work with wax, there's an evolving that occurs there from clumsy to finesse. And like in music, you have to practice. It doesn't just happen overnight. And in experimenting, I learned to pay attention to my own process. So when working, like other artists, this is a duh kind of a thing. If you're good, you're paying attention to what you're doing while you're doing it. And there's a lot of lessons from point A to point B and point C. And those become memories, and those memories serve future pieces. And that certainly was true in my case.
Painting to sculpture, where does drawing fit into that?
Okay, another good question. The paintings got thicker and thicker. I learned about impasto. So pretty soon I was painting with a palette knife. And my teacher said, you really ought to take sculpture because these are beginning to look like reliefs. So I did, you know.
So you weren't one to keep a sketchbook?
No, I didn't keep a sketchbook. I wanted everything to be a new surprise. So to me, working with wax, you can sketch. You can make something and change it very quickly. It's not cast metal. It's malleable. It's
kind of 3D sketching.
Yeah, you can. Well, I would not call them sketching. I would call them desperate attempts to make art.
Okay.
That failed, and I'm always been willing to throw things away if they don't work. And so the wax gave me an opportunity to try and fail again, and finally get something, and then learn whether or not I should repeat it. A lot of sculptors make an image and then make a mold and repeat that image over and over again, and I don't. I do not make additions, very rarely make additions, and I prefer that we have these one-off situations. So in making sculpture eventually, I wanted to make bigger sculpture, which required more money. And so I thought that probably I ought to work this out on paper before I get too far into my pocketbook. And that led to drawing for making sculpture like a diagram.
Gotcha.
But I really didn't like them because they were too stilted. But they did get me on paper. So then we moved to Rome. And in Rome, I didn't have a foundry. In fact, I didn't have any money or anything. And so I really started drawing while I'm in Rome. And I've never stopped drawing since that time, which wasn't that far out after I got out of college, and I've already started teaching, but I wasn't that old at that point to not keep thinking this is all a gigantic exploration. So drawing, of course, had the same kind of flexibility that waxworking did. So I just kept drawing. And I was never particularly interested in drawing diagrammatically, particularly. I'd be more interested in making a drawing that was in and of itself a finished artwork, not a preliminary for something else. Same reason for the sculpture. I mean, I want that danger, so to speak, of failing to be part of the motivation that keeps me moving.
Right.
I think that's something that artists can universally recognize.
Yeah, I definitely appreciated it in my photography. That risk of, oh, there may not be, you may have nothing.
Yes.
You may have absolutely nothing.
Right, exactly.
And so when you get something, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
So moving into large sculpture presented that problem. I need money. And that led to drawing as well.
Well, drawing in order that I could begin to understand that I could make horribly expensive mistakes if I didn't know what I was doing.
Yeah.
So
a little more planning.
They were like minor blueprints for avoiding error.
Mm-hmm. At some point, you merged these two.
Right. The beginning of the merger between sculpture and drawing had also its foundation in Rome. Not having a foundry, but very much wanting to make shape. I was able, until I got a foundry in the second year of Rome. I did get a foundry, but I built one. But I started making drawings that were shaped drawings.
Yes.
And so I made odd things like cone heads and just all kinds of bizarre stuff. We use framing materials that were dimensional. like a frame that was too deep for the aesthetic of the drawing, and mixing it up in such a way that I wanted something that I didn't know what I wanted exactly, so I was working toward making sculpture into something beside metal. It didn't really work, but it did lead me to welding up shaped frames. It did lead me to fabricating small objects that could be work by themselves rather than cast metal. And so like putting them together was a cinch. I mean, it just was a natural to me because I also was sometimes embedding sculpture in drawing. So these objects on the drawings were something that started in Rome.
Now, the piece behind you has all of those things you were just discussing.
Yes, it does, but it has something more. It has what I would call a kind of nonsensical literature in it. So writing has also been something I've used in the work for a long time. It has nothing to do with literature. It does have to do with language and communication and speaking and establishing a dialogue either with an object or with another human inside the drawing. Even though you as a spectator can't figure out what they're saying, that's fine with me because I want you to develop your own dialogue about what you're looking at. And if I fill in all the blanks, we're back to illustration again. If I tell the story in my writing, you don't go anywhere. If I don't tell the story, but I set up a curiosity in terms of what's happening there, you will make a story if you stay there long enough. So that's what interested me. It's another way of engaging the spectator. Also, there are symbols in the piece behind me that are recognizable, but not always to everybody that comes into an art gallery. Like one of the symbols on here, this little symbol right here is the Navajo sign for rain. But who would know that? You wouldn't know that unless you back up now and you go to teaching, or when I was doing the research to find out something about a Native American student that I had, then I went back and looked at their own mythology, and then I started seeing all these images, and that all becomes part of an image bank that I can use or that I can access. And the little man, I didn't want to produce an image of a man. I just wanted to produce a generic male. So this is built sort of like armor. And I wanted him to be both speaker and receiver. So in my mind, he's being bombarded by all these things around him. But he's also talking back. So it's a bit of a dialogue. If there was a dominant force here, I'd say he's being bombarded more than he's giving out. But there's all this writing.
Right.
And it's very tiny. And to me, I like these big, bold images because they make the spectator go right up to the surface. Then the spectator, if they're paying attention, has another, I hope, visual treat.
Right,
And all the elements that are now tiny. So.
What do you think got you so interested in communication or lack thereof? As far as that sort of topic.
I don't know. I could put that back on teaching again, because of course you have to speak in order to communicate when you're teaching. But no, I don't know. I want spectators to be engaged in the work, either completely on a visual sense, like in these big flower drawings, or in a more conceptual sense. I view them as decorative, sure. But I also view them as ways to bring the spectator into a situation. Not always, but sometimes. So sometimes you'll approach the drawing of some flowers and they'll be writing. Or you'll approach a drawing like that one over there and there may be a narrative involved that has to do with our interaction with nature, or this woman's interaction with the space inside of a building. Or a letter form like the one over here. This one's more literate. So certainly we can say that there's language in use like these, like that. there was a lot to notice when my father got a job with Walt Disney in Hollywood, and we moved to Hollywood, and I got to see film sets and movie sets and movie locations and so on and so forth. And we lived in Toluca Lake, and 3 blocks from our house was the very lot that they filmed Tarzan in. And my buddies and I would go over there and shoot spit wads at each other, you know. But that was an evocative time. Now what I took from that, I really couldn't say. When we got to the Bay Area, San Francisco, very, very vibrant art scene out there. And
so what year are we in now?
now we're in, we got to Northern California when I was just in the middle of the 7th grade. Late 50s for me.
Okay.
Okay? And so I lived in the Bay Area during the 60s. That was interesting.
I would say so.
Yeah. And so, another evocative period of time.
Absolutely. Poetry.
Poetry, yeah. Huh. Well, we used to go to North Beach, and there was a place called City Lights Bookstore.
Oh yeah. Still there. It survives the pandemic, hopefully it does.
We could go listen to Lawrence Ferlinghetti talk on the sidewalk. Yeah, some pretty good times back there. But we really weren't involved in that. We were busy working. I mean, in the first part of the 60s, we were in college. And trying to get by in college with very little money. So at that point in time, just to make sure you know how old I am, each college credit cost $15. And the other person we would see, but in the bookstore in Menlo Park where I lived, was Joan Baez. And by the time I got to college, I lived in this house, and one of the persons that used to visit, Thorne Kinsey, was a poet. And a good friend of Joan Baez, I still lived in Big Sur at the time, and was dating Bobby Dylan. So we went to
Bobby Dylan. I've never heard him called Bobby. Okay, proceed.
So we had some experiences. We got to go to a party in Berkeley, California, where Dylan was there. He made a pass at my wife. It was pretty wild and woolly, but we were not involved in it. We were involved in making sure we passed courses like oceanography.
Yeah.
Because the input of the 60s, I can't explain. I was not big on drugs. I was big on work. You also gain heroes, which is something I use in teaching. Is what are heroes? Well, heroes would be those artists of your generation or not that you have enormous respect for or admire because they're so freaking good. I was interested in some contemporary sculptors like Tito Giambruni at UC Davis, but he's gone now. I mean, some of these people are gone. Overall, I much admire most of the people who were involved in the Bauhaus, men and women. But in particular, Kandinsky, Klee, and concrete poetry, for instance, the use of language, but not necessarily in a narrative way, like a single word might be a whole poem. I thought that was flabbergasting. So when you get flabbergasted, then you've been impressed.
Yeah. Of course, I think the thing that is probably a more fascinating part of your life would be, your time during the round prize.
Sharon and Sabina basically operated on their own. So what they did when Sabina wasn't in school was they went out and toured the city. So they saw more of Rome than I did.
All right, I'll be more jealous of them.
But of course, saw a lot of Rome. So, and to me, Rome is a walking city. It has this long street called Via del Corso. It starts at the Victoria Emanuele and goes forever. And we walked it many, many times. And along the way are some of the most famous plazas. Piazza Navona, for instance, which is one where we would go to eat ice cream at Giolitti's, had fire eaters and dancers and fortune tellers and artists drawing other artists and people looking at the fountains and, I don't know, 6 restaurants maybe. It was incredible. 2 huge fountains by Bernini. So we would go and hang out in those kind of places. Those were the relaxing times, which were fine with me. I never felt any stress, quote, taking time to go do that sort of thing, because it was a whole new culture. I mean, you were seeing new things, and I had all the time I needed all day long in the studio. It was ridiculous. Well, I've always worked. I never had that kind of time, ever. And, you know, when you have time like that, I think, it sounds funny, but new areas of your brain wake up. And that certainly happened. Not only that, but you're also constantly accumulating images, from the graphic arts in shop windows to what you see in museums to cultural icons that the city's put in over the years.
Now, did you speak any Italian?
The way that worked, there were 3 of us, Sharon, Sabine, and myself. So I learned hardware store Italian.
Okay.
Sharon learned grocery store Italian, and Sabina filled in around the edges. And it worked. If we were together, it worked. If we weren't together, it really didn't work.
Well, with the language being foreign, and then of course, you know, how language is incorporated in your work,
I hadn't thought about that, but language was not present in the work before Rome as a device. Not at all. Nor were that many drawings. I mean,
right.
I really started drawing in earnest in Rome.
Right. So when did language come in?
Probably in Rome. I'm not sure I could put a pinpoint on that, but we did travel to museums. And as you go north, you run into museums that specialize in, say, for instance, the Futurists. And actually, the National Museum in Rome has a lot of those people in it too. And gosh, the fantastic surrealists from that group, the Dadaists, and it's just littered with language. Sometimes used as a form, like a sculptural form for the letter W or something like that, and sometimes used for language. Sometimes used in concrete poetry that I know very little about. But I did start to see images in the artwork. That just crept in. I mean, that was, and I never really, I'm not particularly interested in being a narrative, that kind of narrative. So it never interested me to tell a story using language. But it did interest me to provoke questions on the spectator's part about why the language is in there at all. And I thought that was interesting, quote interesting, but also fun. And I do think that there's a bit of pranksterism in trying to fool your spectator a little bit. That might come from my California days. The biggest trip we took was to track the influence of Antonio Gaudí in Italy and then in Spain. So we drove a route based on being able to see, especially once we got across the top, dropping down into Spain, from site to site to try and see these works. I guess because I've always been interested in that. There's a certain element of fantasy to Gaudí that I find remarkable, just completely remarkable. And I'm not religious, but going into Sagrada Familia is breathtaking.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time had no roof at all.
Right.
What you see evolving and devolving in Gaudi's work is Moorish architecture, Moorish symbology, and so on and so forth. So it goes from in Gaudi's work, especially Sagrada Familia, there's whole walls that are all geometric, and then there's whole walls that are all organic. And if you look at the facade, it is organic and mechanical. So this idea of combining geometry and geometric form is something that I was already involved with, and seeing it used by Gaudi just reinforced it even more so. So I spent time, I think I spent time in the drawings trying to relate shape to shape and transitioning from organic to mechanical and back and forth. That was something that was really interesting to me.
Well, so just a moment ago you were talking about how this time of, you know, not having to work, not having to work, and being able to, you know, really have that deep, unstructured time in the studio. Well, now you're retired.
And I'm back in the studio.
So are you feeling some of those same feelings, or, you know, how is it different that time to now?
Wow, that's a huge question. Totally different for sure, because in Italy or in Europe, whether it was during that period of time or subsequent visits, I was always open to external stimulus. But in retirement in my house, especially during quarantine, the stimulus has to come from inside. So it's a very different arrangement.
Well, there's been a few years before the pandemic.
Well, that's true.
You didn't have to stay holed up.
No, but I've always been a museum goer, so there's always that. Texas has some great museums, but I was fine allowing. I've always been okay allowing my brain to wander, and every now and then it will capture something that I manage to get on a piece of paper, or I'll start with a piece of paper that's blank, or a sheet of wax, or a tube of wax, or something, and almost like child's play, allow that particular start to begin to evoke something. It's not a new thing. Artists have been doing this forever. So it's basically you make a mark, another mark will follow that mark based on the mark you just made, and then mark makes mark, and so on and so forth. And pretty soon you have a shape. And the shape might remind you of something, or at least in my mind it does, which might then lead to a vocabulary based on what that shape seems to be eliciting. And pretty soon you've got a format. And this is the way that I basically have always worked. So I mean, Italy allowed more shapes to come in, more information to come in, and retirement allowed headspace to occur so that there was lots of room for something to happen. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I've always liked Klaus Ollenberg's interview I heard on the radio once, and somebody asked him why he goes to the studio every day. And he said, well, of course, he said, because something might happen.
Yeah.
And that's a great answer, because that's exactly what happens.
So I'm glad we got on this, because I was curious, like, how you start working. You know, yes, you know, many artists may do this, but every artist does approach, you know, the process differently. And you know, so it sounds like you start from, you know, kind of a meditative space, or
I'm okay with that word, meditative space, but I would say
Like an
an
openness.
uncluttered mind
Yeah.
at that point, you know? So sometimes I have to stop and declutter. and so that I can allow that to happen. I guess that's right. Sometimes I go for a walk. There's a lot of ways to do that, but I guess while you were asking the question, I was thinking, boy, it's really true when I'm making sculpture that something might come up. And also in terms of visualizing, I would say in sculpture, I've made enough sculpture for long enough that I can create in my mind's eye a three-dimensional picture of an object before I start. I can do that. I cannot do that with drawings. They shift too much. But with sculpture, for a lot of reasons, one of which is financial, I've always wanted to be able to limit what I'm doing. I guess I would say limit. And or articulate in such a way that I don't over-express. I'm hearing that for the first time. Let me just be simpler about that. I almost always know what I'm going to do to a small extent with the sculpture, but do not with the drawings, except maybe the new flower drawings, because they're similar. So I've been thinking about them in terms of more subtle images, more subtle mark-making systems.
That some planning is going into some of that.
Yeah.
What's your favored approach? Planning or not?
All right, I'm going to oversimplify it. Just starting.
Okay.
I mean, that's what gets me going.
That's a reasonable answer.
Yeah. I mean, you have to start. Absolutely have to start. And also, then you have to have a private space to do it. At least I do. You have to have some beatitude. You have to have. For me, conditions have to be very particular in the studio. I do listen to music, but I do not listen to music with words. I'm not interested in hearing somebody else's dialogue when I'm working on my own. That's ego, but it also is a way of focusing.
Right, it's less distraction.
Right. So I often listen to new age piano pieces, for instance. A very common thing for me to listen to because they're melodic, they're not overly burdensome. It's very different. I like compared to the Rolling Stones, for instance. I can listen to the Rolling Stones, but it's a different attitude. And so day by day.
Those do have words.
Yeah, well, I know, but they have. Yeah, that's right. but I'm more likely to listen to the Rolling Stones doing sculpture than I am listening to the Rolling Stones doing drawing. Because as I said before, I know what I'm doing with the sculpture, and I don't when I'm doing the drawing. So it's not so much of a distraction to get to your correct inquiry there.
Where do you see or want to see your work going in the future?
Do you mean for me personally, or
Yeah.
you mean out in the world?
Either, both.
Both. Well, I'm pretty interested in these combination drawings. And in fact, I just started a new one. It's even bigger than this one. In order to do them, I have to have the little objects that are going to go in the drawings pretty much already in hand or very much in my mind, because they'll have to be made and then taken to the foundry and then returned back to the shop and drilled and tapped and so on and so forth, colored, whatever's going to happen. But I like to have them available so that I can tone the drawing and the objects in some way into a relationship.
Right.
Not tone, but tune them one to another. This is an interesting thing to me to a certain extent, because it's not very many people do this. Many, many years ago at Museum of Modern Art, Don Lipsky was making a little piece in the lobby of the Museum of Modern Art. And he's an artist who went to the same graduate school I did. And so I could ask him what he was doing. He had some kind of thing the museum was doing to encourage young artists. And he was making sculpture out of, I think they were like wooden matches or something. It was remarkable, it just blew me away. And he was an inspiration for looking at future work by the same artist. Flat work with dimensional work, found object with made work, and the most unusual contextualizations of shapes imaginable. So I would like to follow on with these, and I've always wanted to make big sculpture, and I just get frustrated because I don't have the money to make big sculpture.
Yeah.
I just don't. And these little pieces in this room, some of them I would really like to see, you know,
Big.
not big, I'm not interested in sculpture which intimidates, but I would be interested in seeing these much more so at human scale, so that you looked at them one to one, rather than looking down at them or across at them, that they would be right in front of you as a presence. And I look forward to maybe being able to do that. I do very poorly on public art commissions, so I'm not very good with the paperwork. I'm usually more caustic than what they want. So I know.
Maybe a little more pricey, because you deserve it.
Very expensive, yeah. But it's, so I would like to be able to do that. That is to say, large-scale commission work, but I'm not interested in making commission work that is subject to some sort of thematic restrictions, scale restrictions, or whatever. I don't mind site restrictions. And I just started one. I told you this morning. I just started a big one. It's probably more like 5 by 8
Oh,
feet.
wow.
And it's laying flat. I work on these flat, not on an easel or anything like that. I view them almost like maps, looking at a map.
How do you get to the middle if
It's freestanding. It's a big sheet of honeycomb aluminum, what I'm working on right now. But to get around it, I have it on 2 sawhorses that I can walk around the whole thing. So I can walk around it and locate things from the top or the bottom or whatever.
So the drawing, the paper is on top of this honeycomb?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. In this case. In the case of one I'm working on now, I'm pretty sure already that I'm going to leave the aluminum exposed, because I'm going to put drawings on the surface of this big panel. So I guess I would say
Not necessarily covering it?
no, not necessarily covering it. It may be a series of objects that include drawings,
I see.
rather than a drawing that includes objects. Wait a minute. It's going to be a combination of drawings and frames and objects.
Another pushing of the envelope.
Yeah, there we go. And it's already causing me to have to rethink a whole bunch of things. So, but you're right. That's one way of growing. I mean, you just set up a problem for yourself, and then you have to solve it.
So you got onto this from the question about the foundry and routing.
Right. So first there was the foundry at San Jose.
Yeah.
Then there was the foundry at Cranbrook. Then my first job was at University of Minnesota, where I installed a foundry, meaning that I had to make the furnace personally and get it hooked up, figure out a way to run the kiln, teach the students how to use it all, and then I could use it myself. So that was at University of Minnesota. Then after Minnesota, the next foundry I built was at Humboldt State University in Northern California, and that turned out to be a really good foundry, with the biggest one in the state of California at the smallest university in the state of California. So that was fun. So
By the time you got to Rome, it was old hat.
yes, yes.
Is the foundry still in use? Are any of these foundries that you built
Well, the
still in use?
University of Minnesota, the fellow that took my place when I left Minnesota, became one of the main forces behind an American iron casting movement, which is going strong.
And so that foundry is still then in use, I'm assuming.
Yeah, the foundries that I built that are still in use at Penland School of Crafts in North Carolina, University of Minnesota, Humboldt State University, the American Academy in Rome, built that one. By built, in that case, I mean that I literally made the furnace, not necessarily, these are all handmade foundries, they're not store-bought foundries. With the exception of the one in Rome, in that case we did buy the furnace. But I guess, so it's just an industrial process, but if you go back to what's fascinating about it, to me, is something that foundry freaks often talk about, which is this sort of mystical aspect of starting with nothing and ending up with something. Because you start out with wax, which is impermanent. You go and attach this sort of plumbing system to the wax, and then you put it in a mold. There's several types of molds, but then you bake the mold to evacuate the wax, which means that leaves a hollow space inside the mold. At that point, there is nothing there, literally, nothing. It's a void. The void is then replaced with metal, and that is a transformative aspect of the process that a lot of people get very worked up about as being magical or whatever. I just thought it was more like Christmas. You didn't know what you had until you opened your mold, and I was always wanting to get the mold open so I could see what I had, because at that point, a lot of work that still gets done on the object. Filing and sanding and polishing and fixing and so on and so forth. Ultimately, the patina, which is the last step, is the coloration. And those are the parts I wanted to get to. So the actual casting itself was just a process. However, when you're teaching casting, which I've also done the whole time, then there can be, but there is not always, a team aspect to it. So students get together and work. Students, you have to work together to run the foundry. So students would then team up and work the foundry. And I view that as a kind of gift within the teaching framework. It's not like people sitting at individual desks and allowing their bones to get numb. I mean, they're up and at it and doing things, and I think that's great. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this might be both a very big and a very simple question.
Okay.
Why do you make art? I think everyone's motivation is different.
Oh, I agree with that. There's a book on Rodin, I can't remember the name of the book, but in the afterword to the book that's written about Rodin, there's a quote from Rodin, and it says, if you want to be a mathematician, yada, 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 learn how to use numbers. If you want to be an architect, learn how to use a ruler. If you want to be a poet, learn how to use words. If you want to be an artist, it must be because there's nothing else. And that sounds like an evasive comment, but it isn't to me, because what keeps us going? I mean, it's this need to continuously reinvent yourself, I guess. So it is then, like what Rodin said, it must be because there's nothing else, because that has to keep, that has to keep you going. If that makes any sense.
Okay.
A little zen, but that's I think a reasonable
Now, if
answer.
you didn't have Rodin to fall back on, what would you have replied?
I've never not been creative. I mean, from the third grade when I started to learn how to use a musical instrument on all the way through, I've never not had a go-to spot for creativity. I guess because I wanted it that way. I would say something which you may or may not want to include, and that is,
Okay.
I make art because I want to. That's the most honest answer.
I like that answer.
This piece called Hybrid in front of me. It has a Padre image looking at a Duchampian bottle washer type image with thorns on it. And what I wanted with this piece was to set up a situation so that instead of walking up to something that looks right back at you, you look at something which tends to be involved in some process. And so this character is involved in the process of gazing at this form while we gaze at him. So it's somewhat a reversal of the usual situation. Another person that's more evident to me in this room as a hero is Miro, which we didn't mention earlier. So I'm looking across at a drawing that has him, that was done in Spain, and I was able to visit the Miro Museum there often, and some of Miro's thoughts drifted into the work. There's no question about it. I do believe that art comes from art, among other places. So this is not pleasurism, it's more pleasureism.
I like that.
To be really corny. The notion of a machine man or a robotic image, it's not really a robotic image to me. It's like part of where I cut my teeth as far as looking at other sculptors. We're and still are sculptors who combine mechanical and organic forms. So the organic form in some cases could be floral, they could be human. And then the mechanical is that which is more machine-like or rigid.
What is it about man and machine that interests you?
People think the mechanical form is something which is not, has no emotion. In the other room, there's some smaller sculptures that are much more mechanical and organic. And there's one called Digger, and Digger to me, which is the red one, is very indicative of a form which looks like a machine, but it also operates like an animal. It has legs, it has a function. In that case, the function is drilling into the ground like an anteater. So it interests me to take the mechanical and imbibe it with a personality, perhaps, let's put it that way. But also to set up contrasts. I mean, I like dichotomy. So if I can set up a dichotomy between straight line and organic shape, I think we immediately have more interest than just organic or just mechanical. And so that contrast is something that permeates the work, no question about it. I'm not particularly interested in the machine, but I do enjoy looking at machinery for those elements of machinery which to me are anthropomorphic. And I'm liable to steal them. If I think that I'm liable to steal them if I think that they're good, you know?
I guess that's the boy in you.
The one called Makeup is another example like Hybrid, only much more recent. Putting the spectator in the position of being a voyeur, so that we have to come and observe what's going on. And Makeup to me is almost better in that than this one, because if you finally locate the fact that you can see yourself in the mirror, you can see what she's saying. And I just think that's a curiosity. It's an image of a little head speaking into a gigantic head. I mean, the head is, the whole work is almost 20 feet tall. And then as we see this little head or discover this little head talking into the big head, we also realize that information is going in to the big head from the little head, and the ideas coming out from being mentored are all these things exploding from the head, like knowledge. Or excitement, or what have you. And so that's a more, quote, normal way I might use images coming out of the head.
And that piece, of course, is being on the university campus in Valencia and, you know, having a nod to your own career and life as a professor and teacher, a visual biography of your life in a way.
I had an opportunity to set up an exchange program at the University of Valencia. So we brought a professor over from Valencia, and then I went over there. Pablo brought me to Valencia, and of course I had to write all the class stuff out and have it interpreted. It had to be written in Spanish, but I don't speak Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a great experience. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Later, several years later, the university invited me to have a show over there. And the president of the university saw the catalog for the show. And there was a couple of pieces in the catalog that he liked. And so he told Pablo to ask me if I could make something like that. And it immediately came to mind to make this piece called Mentoring, because it was a university.
Right.
And that's what universities should be about. And so I was commissioned to make this piece, and I made a model here. We shipped the model to Spain, and Pablo had his own students and another faculty member in sculpture enlarge the piece.
Oh my gosh.
No, not just my gosh. Usually the way that happens is you take in a little model and the foundry will enlarge it for you using mechanical systems. Well, my model was almost 7 feet tall. So, but this was going to be much bigger than that. I can't work really, really tiny and express all these ideas very well. So I made it, I think, 7 feet tall. I thought they'd cut it out and measure it and so on and so forth. Nope. They left it still, and instead they made a whole line system in a room with rulers and tape measures and everything under the sun, and then photographed it every which way, and then modeled the reproductions of those forms. It's flabbergasting. Then they had them cast at the foundry, and then when it was ready to assemble, I went over and we put the whole thing together in Madrid. But incredible.
Compare that to how things get blown up now.
Well, now you
It's
can
like
just take a
easier.
digital picture of it
Exactly.
and have somebody else make it. I mean,
Yeah.
and it's all changed.
Yeah.
It's all changed, which to me is not necessarily a great thing.
No, it's not.
Yeah. If you don't understand your technique, you can't manipulate it.
Yeah.
And I think in manipulating technique, then we make progress, often, in sculpture especially. We're standing in front of a piece from 2002 called Two Heads. That was actually done in Italy. We've been talking about Italy earlier. And it's an exploration in shape. There's thousands of little shapes throughout the piece. This is kind of like that phenomenon from your childhood when you're looking at a tree and suddenly inside the tree you're starting to see goblins or creatures or other beings. And my thought here was eventually you might discover that there's, for instance, two eyes here peeking out. So you might begin to think that this is a head, or over here perhaps this is an eye, and maybe that's an eye, maybe not. So this is a drawing done to imply things, not necessarily to represent. And so I view these little mechanical forms down here as containers or holders,
Okay.
or sculpture bases or stands or something. So that allows an area for the drawing to emanate out of kind of boxes and then explode into, in this case, explode, in that case, contain an image which is amorphous and hard to identify. And I guess I would say that's another way that I might be able to bring people into the drawings.
You know, reminds me of in a way of the objects protruding from the head, these
Mhm.
tangible thoughts, or all of the minutia of our daily lives.
Mhm.
Everything that makes up the human, you can't fit in the human.
But that they are human.
Yeah.
Yeah. Huh, good thought. So the other word to use here to me is to imply. So it's another example of hoping to imply information and then let the spectator pick it up from there. Looking at a drawing which is based on the idea of writing a visual letter. These all started earlier as a way to make new forms that were eventually going to be sculptures. And in the long run, they became a way to make a drawing without making a traditional, say, single focal point perspective drawing. So these are done in rows. Here's a row, there's a row, and here's a row. Although this row actually breaks down into a dialogue between a man and a woman, and finally a kind of still life down at the bottom as a signature. That might not make sense to you as a real letter, but there are fields of information here which to me are curious. For instance, she has a lot of possessions and a flower pot. He has no possessions, but a lot of sperm.
Okay.
So as we go down here, we see combinations of mechanical and organic, and the kind of things that we've been talking about. The sign for infinity, mixed in with an architectural form, is also an organic and mechanical form. Not that that's necessary to repeat. Things that look like they ought to be symbolic, I invented, they're not. They're just implied. So back to the notion of implying things. There's an implied sailboat. They're having a conversation across space, which is a way of breaking down the rows. So we go in rows and then we just shoot across space in a diagonal. And they're trying to talk to each other. I would leave it up to you as to determine whether or not they are succeeding at that. And then finally we end up with the signature area over here, which relates to the beginning form over here. These are fun to do.
Well, you can definitely see the play.
Ah, good.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of these, and I always date them by the date of the day that I finish the drawing.
She has an interesting assortment of objects.
She does. I don't have any real comment about that. The irony board is not an effort to just suggest domesticity. In contrast, for instance, the man's hat might be a guy that she's used to see or not, but you know, then there's her wardrobe and high-heeled shoe and blah, blah, blah. There was no intent and a narrative over there. I just wanted an assemblage of elements for you to begin to describe for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
These are all, the titles on these are funny because the 8 represents the month, and then there's the year, which is 2020, and then 5 represents the number in sequence of how many of these I've done. And then in parentheses is the word text, which is an identifier because this particular drawing has, of course, a text.
Okay.
And this is an example of a text that doesn't say a damn thing. But it does say, let me in. And a few more things here, and the word pretty maybe, but
Oh no, it has more. I would like to know when you could come to, and then gibberish, and let me in on the secret pretty soon. Pretty soon. Would you write soon?
So it could be, the implication here seems to be of a love letter, but it's a collage taken off of another drawing that had much more text on it. And I just cut it out of the other drawing and attached it here as a collage element. This is also a collage, as is this, as are the pods for the flowers up here. The branches and so on and so forth, hand drawn. And that to me is typical of me because these are mechanical and I can cut them out. Therefore, they're kind of like sculpture. And then the other ones are required drawing, which is the opposite. So I can then go ahead and draw a little tiny leaf. I can make things really, really little and really, really big. And also I can bring in, this is part of another drawing. These are all parts of old drawings. And they each bring their own sense of information. So these have been of interest to me. I started this series, I think I'm now up to 8 of these. These are from late last year. And so here's the mechanical organic again. This looks like a stalk, but it isn't a stalk. This is a stalk, but isn't a stalk from reality. These are not real flowers, they're inventions. And that's, again, back to the implied floral form. It's not a zinnia, nor a daisy, nor this. Maybe the leaves are close to representation, but I don't know what plant, who knows?
Now you have a big relationship with plants personally. Is that at all?
Well, I
present
think
in
I
these?
think that you're in reference to my collection of plumeria trees, of which I have about, I don't know, 18 plumeria trees.
That's a lot.
And to me, they're just fantastically beautiful. It's a Hawaiian plant, And they have these gorgeous, gorgeous leaves, and of course the flowers are the ones they make the Hawaiian leis out of that you put around your neck. I like growth forms. I very much enjoy going out and looking at plants opening up. Here in Texas, we've just gone through a freeze, and most of our plants now have closed down, which is very unfortunate. So this is a way of making it. These plants are weatherproof.
I suppose so. I suppose so.
Yeah, and it's the height, I think, and this that gives these pieces their oomph as far as scale goes. It also gives me plenty of room to work on, so I can start down here, which is what I do. I start with the pot, and then I build from there, and we eventually put the flowers in it, and so on and so forth. So these are about themselves, and also the process of their own making.
Well, and plants have become very important to people in the last year in their home environment, being stuck at home.
Huh, I hadn't thought about that, but sure. And these were done when I was stuck at home too.